welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Today, we're going to be reevaluating the history of humanity's most enduring account of bondage and emancipation and freedom. Yes, we're going to be talking about the Great Exodus and how one man, empowered by a divine epiphany, brought the mighty nation kingdom of Egypt to his knees. And to do that, we'll be talking to Scotty Roberts and John Ward about their book. I'd say new book, but it's not real new, but their book, The Exodus Reality. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. So if there's stuff going on in your life, give me a call, drop me a note, and we can set up a time for a private consultation. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. That's appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And if you haven't gotten your copy of Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, it is always available on Amazon.com as a digital download. But you can also get it in a actual DVD format from the Soul Healer website. And we have a big special going on. You can save 36%. That's right, 36%. If you order the Icon DVD, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, and Avoiding the Cosmic 2x4, all in one package. And the best part is, it all comes signed, autographed by me. That's priceless. Let me tell you a little bit about Scotty and John, and we will get them on the air. Scott Allen Roberts is an accomplished historian, theologian, writer, public speaker, illustrator, and designer. He attended Bible college and theological seminary, but left for a nearly 30-year career in advertising. He is the founder of the Paradigm Symposium and publisher of Intrepid magazine. He is also the author of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim and The Secret History of the Reptilians. He lives with his wife in Wisconsin. John Ward, on the other hand, throughout the years, John Richard Ward has conducted numerous investigations into ancient Egypt architecture and symbolism and has explored the trade routes of the Western Saharan Desert. Ward was also recruited by the Knights Templar of Britannia, who have actively sponsored him to conduct several archaeological and historical surveys and expeditions. He and his partner, Dr. Maria Nilsson, are currently engaged in the epigraphic surveys at the quarries of Gebel, at the quarries in the south of Luxor on the Nile. So please welcome Scott Roberts and John Ward. Hey, guys, how are you?
Hey, Dr. Rita, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, John?
I'm doing fantastic at 2 a.m. in the morning. Rita, why did you have so much problems there with silsila? It's a simple word, silsila.
Because I'm dyslexic and I have no phonics skills. And so I just have learned, I just skip over them and move on to the next word.
Skip a bit, brother.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I find very interesting in working in this field. I mean, my area that I love is looking at the mythology, but you're dealing with all of these gods that have names that, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce. And so I come up with alternate descriptions of them so I don't even have to try to butcher their names.
I like it. I like it.
Scotty, you have been on the show a couple of times. We have talked about your history and background. And if anyone wants to get a little biographical information on you, I would recommend that they go to the archives. John, on the other hand, this is your first time to the show. Welcome.
No. I believe I've been here before.
Yes.
Were we not here when we did
I think
a
you're
live
mixing
show?
that up with about 10,000 other shows. Didn't we do a live broadcast from Egypt on your show?
We did a live broadcast from Saqqara.
Nope,
that wasn't Rita. Not from Saqqara.
Sure.
I'm positive.
John, you were supposed to come on the show, and I don't know. We had huge miscommunications, and it never happened. So,
Gremlins in the machine.
This is your first time, but welcome.
I feel like a virgin. Oh my God. Well,
be gentle with him, Rita.
I will.
Especially mentioned the word bondage in the beginning there, so please do be gentle.
Oh, I'm off to a good start then, huh?
Keep in mind, it's 2 a.m, and he lacks all responsibility for what comes out of his mouth at 2 a.m.
That's okay. Could you just share with the listeners a little of your background, who you are, what you do, and what got you here? I mean, not here to the show, but here as far as your study of Moses and the Israelites and the Exodus.
My God. That's going to be a long
in 25 words or less.
In 25 words or less. Basically, let's just put the clock back about 15 years. And when I first left the matrix of England, back then I was what you would call a real estate agent, I suppose, in America, a junior partner. And I was working my way through life, married with children and Range Rover and Audi and a mortgage and a credit card to boot. And I decided that it wasn't what I wanted. Life was fantastic. I had everything anybody could dream of. I played golf on the Sunday. I attended church on Sunday. I ran the local youth club. As I say, I was running for politician with the local council for the Conservative Party. And I had everything that anybody would really desire in life. But I seemed wanting. And it was at that point that I decided that I would pursue my dream, and that was archaeology and history, and more importantly, Egyptology. And so I sold up lock, stock, and barrel and moved to Egypt and didn't look back. And from there on, I began a journey of exploration and archaeology. And of course, that started for me in Luxor, ancient Thebes. And it's really snowballed from there. As far as Moses is concerned, I've always had an affinity with Moses, as Scotty knows. And it was really working in those early days at the Temple of Medina Habu that I realized that there was something remiss from the Moses story, and it kind of grew from there. And it wasn't until Scotty got hold of me and started asking me some questions that we both kind of realized that we had two good theories, opposing theories, but good, sound theories. And we decided to write the book together. And we put or placed our two opposing theories side by side within the book, along with other chapters dealing with things like faith and questions of the Ark of the Covenant and so forth, all of which I had covered over those previous years. And that's really what was the driving component for me, because I'd been researching it for so long. I just was dying to get it down onto paper, even though it kind of got hashed out in the edits and so forth. But I'm very happy with what turned out in the end.
How about you, Scotty? Why write about Moses? You know, I keep wanting to do my Moses, but I think they're sick of me doing it on this show.
Moses.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So it shall be written, so it shall be done. Well, what really started my interest on the topic was way back when I was a kid of, probably 12, 13 years old. And, even before that, I was 11, and it was in Sunday school class at church, and the Sunday school teacher was one of the seminary students that was affiliated with the church, and he gave us all little assignments to write a 100-word or a 200-word paragraph or two on different topics he gave us, and he gave me the topic of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and I didn't know much about it other than what I'd seen on the Ten Commandments as a kid with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner. And Anne Bancroft always gets left in the dust when they mention them. So Anne Bancroft, Vavoom. And so he told me, why don't you go talk to Chucky Ailing? He is a member of our church, and he's an archaeologist, and he's done some of this work before, and he's got some good theories. So I met with Chucky Ailing after church, and he was this short, slightly plump, bald-headed, horn-rimmed glasses for the early 1970s still, and seemed very nerdish, and he filled me in on who he thought was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and he had done some study on it, and he went on to become known as Dr. Charles Ailing. He became the president of the seminary I attended in the early 80s. And he has been, for about the last 30 years, he's been the chair of history at the University of Northwestern, and he's also now the president of the Near Middle East Archaeological Society. And, very knowledgeable on these topics. And I adhered to that basic theory that he gave me, and he gave me very good reasons. And as a matter of fact, 10, 11 years later, when I was in seminary, we had a test on that very topic, presenting the 4 different major theories of orthodox biblical view on who Moses may have been in history. And it stuck with me. And I ended up, when I was in junior high school, middle school, I did a comic book version of Moses and the Ten Commandments, and it won me a scholarship to the church school, the high school. And then I went on to Bible college. I went on to seminary. One of my papers I wrote was on the educational system that Moses may have encountered if indeed he grew up during the 18th dynasty. And it was a big paper I wrote back when I was 21 or 22 years old. And it stuck with me. Different projects throughout life. A few articles I had written on the topic. We did with a company I owned back in the early 90s. We put out a series of trading cards on biblical heroes and villains that were kind of very edgy. And I did a series of 10 cards on the life of Moses and dug into the story as much as you could on the back of a trading card. And so it was a lot of fun over the years, too. And then the opportunity came once I met John, and he is an archaeologist, an Egyptologist, living in Luxor, Egypt. At the time I met him for about 10 years. And I asked him, what's your theory on Moses? I said, do you even think about these topics? And he says, well, Scotty, so happens I do think about that. And we got some great conversation going. And our publisher, New Page Books, I'd done a couple of books with them already. And John came up for the Paradigm Symposium in 2012. Flew him in from Egypt to speak. And he charmed the socks off of our publisher. And
everyone else.
And everyone else. And we ended up getting a contract to do the Exodus Reality, which was not the original title. I think, wasn't the original title, John, something like Exodus?
Scotty's theory is flawed, but John's is fantastic.
I think it was something like Act of God or something migration or I can't even remember. And it was, and the publisher, Michael Pye, and Michael said, too heady for a title. Let's go with The Exodus Reality. And John and I were like, oh, please, it just doesn't work for me. But it grew on us. And lengthy subtitle, Unearthing the Real Historical Moses, Identifying the Pharaohs, and Examining the Exodus from Egypt. And those are the subtitle. And we had a lot of fun writing this book. And that was the first time I'd ever gone to Egypt. I flew out there, and I was there for almost a month, and John took me to all the sites associated with his theories. And just open theories about Moses. And, of course, we saw the other cool historical junk while we were there. And we went out. I'd say the highlight of that trip was going to Sarabat al-Khadim in the Sinai Desert, where we both think, even though our theories on who Moses was are separated by about 80 to 90 years and two, maybe even three, I think 2 generations in the same royal house in 18th dynasty Egypt. We still both came together on Sinai, and the location, we went to this little mountain and went up to the top of the mountain and saw the temples there. And so it was the highlight. And that's what led me into getting into the story of Moses. And you know what? It ain't over yet. John and I are continually talking about, we've got a bunch of other books our agent wants us to work on, things we're working on, things and so on. We could have 5 books published in 1 month if we could ever write them. And but this is one of the books, is a follow-up. It's a return to the Exodus, and because there's just more and more and more information.
While you guys were there in the Sinai Peninsula, no like burning bushes or
yes,
clouds in the daytime and fire at night.
Yes, but I had a salve I gave John for that, so he healed.
You had plenty of cream for that, didn't you?
The burning bush, yes.
Yes.
Ew.
But
moving along.
I do have to tell you something. I do have to tell you something very interesting about the whole burning bush scenario in the Bible. First of all, neither John or I outrightly discount the scriptural account. We just say there's probably a whole lot more to it than what we're seeing, or a whole lot less. And so we don't approach it by saying this didn't happen. We approach it by saying we weren't there. As John has said many times, we weren't there, we don't know. And I always say this about the encounter with the burning bush. This is like the pinnacle turning point for Moses in the story. And he sees God in the burning bush. God talks to him. And, of course, he was the only one there, the only one who saw it, the only one who wrote it down. Much like I said to Whitley Strieber once, who wrote the book, the communion books and so on. I said, you were the only one there, the only one who saw it, the only one who experienced it. You're writing down your experience. I said, much like Moses in the burning bush. And he got a good chuckle out of that. But there's an interesting linguistic twist on this story that I had never heard before.
What's the burning bush mystery?
The burning bush mystery.
Okay.
And it's very interesting.
Okay.
And now, to go
Do I have to have my finger on the mute button on you guys?
Nah, you'll be
All
safe.
right,
This one's safe. This one's safe. This one has to do with the term "I am that I am." That story where, remember when Moses, you could almost picture him kind of leaning into God in his story and saying, "So, whom shall I say sent me?" First of all, that is a big thing, a big to do in the Jewish religion later on. And that is the private name of God. If you knew the name of the deity, and I think this is pan-religious, if you know the private name of a deity, you had some power over it. And you could see Moses leaning in and saying, who shall I tell the people sent me? And in a sense, it's almost God saying, it's none of your damn business what my name is. You tell them I am sent you. I am that I am they speak of. All right? Now, what's interesting, there's a word play. It's an ancient Mesopotamian word play that appears in the Hebrew language in this I am that I am. And if you trace the linguistics, which would take an hour to describe it all, so I'll give it to you in the nutshell. You trace these linguistics back. The I am, that's the second I am, the way it is written in the Hebrew, is an I am that relates to an old Mesopotamian wordplay for the name Enki. And so in essence, what Moses is saying there is God said, I am that Enki they speak of. Now, what's interesting about that is it doesn't put any justification on there. It doesn't say God is saying he's Enki, or it doesn't say God is saying, you know, that God you think is Enki, that's really me. It doesn't tell you either way. But what it does tell you is that the passage is actually something that Moses, had he grown up in Egypt for the first 40 years in the school of the nobility and all of that, that this man knew all the Mesopotamian religions. He incorporated that all, and it's very obvious he incorporated Egyptian spirituality, Egyptian everything into codifying Judaism for the first time, and all these different languages and all these different religious practices. And yet the wordplay you find in the book of Exodus is, I am that Enki they speak of, which I found very interesting and a little bit mind-blowing.
And not Enlil, which I find interesting because he tended to be more of the control guy, you know,
right,
and all about justice. And I always was, my thought, it was always Enlil trying to basically control a group of people into submission.
Well, what's interesting about that whole transmission of thought, of religious thought, is that Enlil, or Elil, as he was known, became eventually 1,500 years later in the Canaanite region and religion, he became known as El, or the base Hebrew word for God, El, or Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon. This is the name for God that came from Enlil, or Elil, which was one of his other names. Same with Enki. Enki was known in the Akkadian culture next door as Ea. So you had Enki Ea in that same transmission of data and religion and people migrating into the Canaanite region. Enki Ea became known as Yahweh, which is, as we know, the Hebrew word, or it's kind of a word that's put together to stand for the name of God, or Jehovah is where Yahweh comes from. And so you've got, very possibly in the Old Testament, and you know, because you've done all this study on the transmission of religion and mythology and so on, when you step outside any kind of religious box to look back in and start examining it, you see, even in the biblical story, you've got the repeat of more ancient gods' names from different religions being incorporated into new religion and bearing the same names, which actually show that there may have been two Godheads represented in the Old Testament.
At least. I
At
think in
least.
the Old Testament they had a lot of whiteout. Okay, so I have to ask this question, not as much to you, Scotty, but to John. So I had Laird come on talking about his Point of Origin book, and Laird's kind of gone over to the dark side and now states that it is possible that there were extraterrestrials in antiquity. Scotty, I kind of figure I know where you're coming from, but John, where do you stand on that whole topic these days?
I would like to say I stand on the heads of those that spout such rubbish. It's a difficult one, actually. Only because I say it's a difficult one because I'm torn sometimes. I have to say outright, publicly, that I 100% do not agree with extraterrestrial visitation in ancient antiquity, first and foremost. And that's my stance. But I'm open. And that's why I do what I do. And we had this discussion the other day, me and Scotty. And because I have unanswered questions myself. I believe in like the paranormal. I believe in different religions. I believe in the dark side, if you want to use that kind of connotation, of the religions themselves, especially the Egyptian Book of the Dead and so forth. And I do have unanswered questions. Now, when it comes to extraterrestrial or ufological parameters, I do have outstanding questions there as well. Do I believe little green men or other entities came from a system or a galaxy and visited Earth and gave us technologies that allowed us to harvest seeds, gave us agriculture, gave us the ability to harness the natural materials like stone to build structures to give us safety and security? No, I don't. No. It's a natural progression of man, and that is evident everywhere I look when I'm in ancient Egypt. Even my own site of Gebel El Silsila, I can take a few steps out into the desert and I can see rock art that is up to 10,000 years old. I can walk a little bit further and I can come up across microlithic sites where man first wielded stone against stone to make small blades, which is 16,000 BC. So when I look at that, and then I look at the quarrying techniques and I measure them up against other quarries around the world, be that sandstone, be that limestone, be that granite, be that diorite, etc., 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 the same methodology has been used throughout all of them. And sorry to say, but good old Giorgio Tsoukalos has got it so wrong, it's unbelievable. When he spouts out that, archaeologists wants us to believe that they used ancient chicken bones to use the quarrying. I've never heard anything so absurd in my life. And this is part and parcel of it, Rita. This is what really gets my gripe, is that these gurus that are out there, and for the record, I don't believe Laird Scranton is a guru. Laird Scranton is a very dear, dear friend, and we've had some beautiful and continue to have some beautiful conversations with regards to his research. And I love the way he goes with it, and I love the way he works with his research itself and the material. And so if Laird's out there listening, looking forward to those continued conversations in October, Laird, at the Paradigm Symposium. But it is... There are unanswered questions, but the methodology, going back to the quarrying, is the same. And we're kind of we even talked about this evening on the Situation Room briefly, and we've talked about it before as well, both Scotty and I, and Rocky Stucci, who we co-host the Situation Room with, and that is that we have responsibilities. Like you do yourself, Rita. You have listeners, you have an audience, you have people who read your books and read your material. You have a responsibility like we do. But when it comes to the gurus of this world, especially within the alternative community, they lack a responsibility. They lose sight of it, and they're more interested in the buck and their ego. And they kind of feed both of those simultaneously without or forgetting and negating any facts on the ground. And I find it rather amusing when they refer to the academia in their ivory towers, untouchable. And yet all of their research is based on our material and our results that we have garnered from hours of laboring in the hot sun of the Egyptian deserts. Yet they're quite happy to go ahead and use our research and write a book on it and then sell it for so many dollars and maintain the lifestyle that they lead by doing so, yet without any buy or leave for what we've done and what we have achieved. And so, extraterrestrial, no. Don't buy it. But I'm open to it.
Well, I was going to go into this whole thing about chickens and how they lay eggs every day, which just seems like a freak of nature. And, well, we have chickens now, and I just am like, how do they do that? How do they pop one of those things out every day? There's not anything else on the planet that pops out an egg every day. I mean, really. Anyway, I'm going to get back to
something
Moses.
there. You're onto something there.
They're probably aliens.
Well, that's where I'm going.
Okay. I see this, Rita. I see this. I see where you're going with this.
Well, and I have to tell you, some of our eggs are like this blue-green color, and I've been saying from the start, they're like alien eggs. They're not white. They're not brown. They're blue-green.
How is your therapy going?
So, Rita, settle down, lay your head against the soft black leather cushion, and tell us everything you're thinking. John will jot down everything. Go ahead.
Yes.
How are you feeling about the eggs?
Just tell us. Don't
moving along. Anyway, let's get back to Moses. You know,
Moses.
He had chickens.
Moses.
Anyway, There are a lot of people that believe that Moses is a constructed character. Do you have any thoughts as to why there's no record of the Israelites and their exodus from Egypt?
Go for that one, Scotty.
No, you go first so I can refute you soundly. Go ahead, John. You go.
Well, actually, I mean, that's basically my part of the theory of Exodus reality, Rita, that the Moses that we see today is a characterization of a factual person, a living person. And in this case, I believe it was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, the great vizier to the pharaoh Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten and the grandfather to the pharaoh, young pharaoh, boy king Tutankhamun. And I believe it was, and Scotty, he kind of comes in here as well with his own theory, and that is that it was the 72 Hebraic scholars who sat in their own little cells, as they're called, in the Alexandria Museum, or the Library of Alexandria, in around about 340-odd BC, at the bequest of Ptolemy and Queen Arsinoe, now Pharaoh Arsinoe, I should say. And they rewrote the history of the Hebrew nation at that point, after their bondage in Babylonia. Now, you don't have to really know your times table and put 2 and 2 together and come up with 4 to know that they would have looked at some of the scrolls in the library to adjudicate what they believed was their history. Now, I believe at that point it is easy to say, I believe, that they would have used some of the scrolls. They would have spoken to the priests of Memphis and so forth, and they would have taken down the oral traditions and mixed that in with what we call today the Torah, or the Old Testament. And within all this, one has to remember that Amenhotep, son of Hapu, at that moment was being deified, or had been deified, as a living god. So here you have a mortal man, a run-of-the-mill man, who became a god due to his achievements, architecturally speaking, with the pharaoh Amenhotep III. But I think we're missing certain components within the history, within the archaeological record. And I believe that one of the other reasons why he was deified was because of what he achieved with what we besieged as the Exodus, and what took place within ancient Thebes during the 18th dynasty. And those are the components that allowed him to be deified, along with the likes of Imhotep, the great architect of Saqqara. And they both had a temple dedicated to him in Thebes at Del Bahari, where pilgrims could go and beseech the healing powers of Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu. And so for me, that was the characterization that they built the character of Moses upon. And as far as the Israelites being remiss from the history books, they're not completely remiss, and Scotty can adhere to this a little bit better than I can, because that was his forte within his own theory, where he was looking at the various facts or the archaeological records surrounding the shepherds, or the Israelites, if you want to call them, even though Israel didn't exist then, so it can't be Israel. They can't call them Hebrews because the Hebrew religion hadn't been invented. So the Egyptians, basically, that left Egypt to find what they called the Promised Land, were Egyptians until the day they stood foot in the land that we today call Israel. But at that time, was part of the Canaanite region. It wasn't Israel. There was no Judaic religion. So we can't call them Jews. We can't call them Hebrews. We can't call them Israelites. They were what they were. Egyptians. Thoroughly Egyptianized.
And is that part of the problem, is that as a group, it wasn't a, nationality or an identified group, and so they could have just been lumped in with the population, and so there really wouldn't be any identifying factors per se to ascribe to them?
I think again, Scotty actually alluded to this in his theory, and has done a very good job of doing so. Actually, not that I want to make his head any bigger, but his theory is flawed. but he does allude to this, and Scotty's more aptly. He can actually articulate this better than I can, and I'm sure he'll chime in a minute. But it's to do with Joseph and so forth, and there were certain aspects of the shepherding religion, shall we say, their culture, that would have been handed down both orally and possibly written as well. And these traditions would have allowed this certain group of people, if they were indeed a certain group of people, to stand out from the rest of the Egyptian populace. But I don't think that's the case. Then that's my side of the theory. I don't believe there was a separation. That's a totally different scheme. I mean, Scotty goes down that route, but I don't. I choose not to segregate them from the Egyptian populace. For me, they were Egyptians, be end and end all. And they just merely left the lands of Egypt due to the chaos and calamity that had unfolded after the calamity that befell ancient Thebes.
And we'll come back to that, okay?
Yeah.
All right. So let's climb over this wall over to Scotty's side of the room. Hi, Scotty. So what's your
Rita?
take on the whole thing?
Well, my take, I am very much aligned with John on many things. We joke with each other and we tease about, I call him Mr. Biblical Minimalist and blah, blah, blah. And he calls me Mr. Bible Study. And, we have our fun and we jibe. And I will say this, on a personal level, my faith has suffered over the years. Suffered is probably the most negative way to put it. It's really fallen to the wayside. I haven't thrown the baby out with all the bathwater, but at the same time, I have questioned so many things. So I state that first because I say when I look at biblical content and biblical history, I'm not so much looking at it through the faith filter anymore. So it's not like, I believe that Moses is that. It's not that. I wanted to look at it, though, and find out, is there efficacious history in the Bible? And this is something John and I have talked about ad infinitum. We'd be walking in the desert in Egypt, climbing a mountain in the Sinai, talking about faith and faith issues and what matters and what doesn't matter and what's historical. And I get a lot of response from people out there that you'll make a statement like, well, in biblical history, it says, and somebody will almost cut you off and want to say, oh, there's nothing in the Bible that's historical. It's all a book of faith and it's all fake, which I find to be as stupid as just about anything non-academic that you can. I can't even think of how to say how stupid that is. If we eliminated all material we have that contains historical data on the basis of whether or not it's contained in religious texts, we'd lose a huge percentage of what we have if we said because it's contained in a religious text, it is not efficacious.
We lose 90% of history.
Absolutely. I mean, even as recent, quote unquote, when you're talking ancient Egypt, as recent as Queen Elizabeth in the Tudor monarchy in England, half of what they did was around politico-religious things, and so it's always going to be part of it. So my first statement, I'll just make a blanket statement. I don't believe because the Bible is a book of faith that the history is inefficacious. I believe there is real history contained in the Bible, and I believe there have been too many intelligent, scholarly people involved over the last century and a half trying to establish that fact to discount the Bible as valid history. Now, it's granted, it's got its faith stories wrapped around the history, or the history wrapped around its faith stories, however you want to look at it. But I think you'll find with all the different writers, over 6 writers of the Bible, that these were all people that were not making stuff up just to create a faith story. I believe there are some facts that are off here and there, but I believe that there's been too much biblical history established. Now, to say that, let me follow up with this, where John and I asked the big question in the book. were the Hebrews really Hebrews, and did they really even exist as slaves? That was the first big question, because there's no Egyptian historical record that says, and the Hebrew slaves came in, and their leader named Moses kicked the Pharaoh's ass. And, there's not going to be a Pharaoh that lists that on any of his chronicles, on any of his temples, or any of his... Now, there may have been some documentation, perhaps scribal documentation.
But why not have some kind of a record of that?
I think that there are records of that, but they're a little more obscure. And unlike John kind of focuses the Moses character and his archetype and the event of the Exodus down in Thebes, which is current-day Luxor, about almost 500 miles south of Cairo on the Nile. I, on the other hand, place it in Memphis, the northern capital, which is up in the Nile Delta region. And as John can tell you, whether he agrees with my theory or not, he does know this, is that scribal records on papyrus in the Nile Delta region are almost non-existent because of the climate there. You've got stone things that are recorded, but scribal records on papyrus, almost non-existent because of the climate there. But I look at the story, and then I look to history, and I say, I can't change history based on the biblical story if I'm not operating on faith, which I'm not. So I push that aside. And I say, does the biblical story fit the historical account of these regions? And can you establish a plausibility? And that might be the closest you ever get. Here's an example of that. First question we asked were, did the Israelites ever migrate to Egypt, like the biblical story tells us? And we all know the biblical story of Joseph, Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. How, there's the story of Jacob's 12 sons, and they're all jealous of the youngest, Joseph. And they take his coat of many colors from him, they throw him in a pit, tell their dad he was killed by a lion or something, and they sell him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, goes to prison, all this. He interprets dreams, eventually dreams for the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh raises him to the status of a grand vizier in Egypt, which is the grand vizier almost by definition would be Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. And you have to look at that story and say, is that all just a romanticized story? Or is there something to this? Why would an Egyptian Pharaoh elevate a Canaanite Bedouin slave to the status of next in command to the throne? And so to look at that, I wanted to look into, and by the way, the biblical dating system places these events to where these dates work very well. You remember the Hyksos period in Egypt. This is where there were foreign rulers who usurped the northern throne of Egypt and divided the kingdom for about 110 years. And they set the seat of their pharaonic throne in Memphis, which is at the mouth of the Nile Delta, about 30 miles from Cairo. And now, in Memphis, you had these Hyksos rulers. The Hyksos, by definition, and the definitions have changed over the years, but the Hyksos were known as the shepherding kings, or the kings from foreign lands who were shepherds. And they were also then known as just simply, they watered it down to just the kings from foreign lands. Now, the Hyksos were a people that over about 800 years in Egyptian history, people from the Canaanite region, the Syrian region, the Mesopotamian region, during times of drought and other times, they would migrate into the Nile Delta region with their flocks and their herds and their families, because it was always wet and it was always, they could go there and expect to find good grazing land. And there are records for almost 800 years of who the Egyptians referred to as the Asiatics. Those from the Middle Eastern region would come into Egypt and settle there. Now, over this 800 years, these people migrated in and they kept settling and settling and settling. And eventually, these people came in and they took over in local governments and then finally just usurped the throne in northern Egypt and established their own monarchy. And they lasted, like I said, for a little over 100 years. Now, these people, by blood, the Egyptians referred to them as the Hyksos, or the shepherding peoples. And the Egyptians hated these people, hated them with a passion. And yet they had this monarchy established in the north. And if you look at the biblical account, remember the story, Joseph is elevated to this great status. And in this story, it reads like a storybook. His brothers, after almost 20 years, show up in Egypt, and they're migrating there. There's drought back in Canaan, and they've been sent. And he reveals himself to his brothers and so on, the whole story.
Oh, but that was after, like, totally punking them.
That's right. He punked the hell out of them. Oh, I think I'll put this goblet in your knapsack there and then arrest you for stealing. There's that whole story that goes along with it. But stepping aside that part of the story, when he's going to grant them land in what the Bible calls the land of Goshen, which is kind of north and east of what is today Cairo and Memphis. It's this fertile region in the Nile Delta. And he's going to grant them this land. And he says to his brothers, now, in the biblical account, he says, now, when you go into Pharaoh to ask for this land, he says, I've got it all set up. You go in and ask him, tell him that you are shepherds, and you have been shepherds from the days of your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And then they go in, and Pharaoh grants them the land. And I thought, why is he telling them to go into the Egyptian Pharaoh and tell them he's shepherds when the Pharaoh hates shepherds? Well, I think there is a plausible connection there historically, that the Egyptians hated the Hyksos, the shepherding peoples, the shepherding kings who usurped the northern throne. And Joseph is saying, now you talk to this guy. He's basically kinfolk. They're all from the same region. And they're going to see you as cousins. And the Egyptians hate shepherds, which is what they are too. And I think it establishes some plausibility. And then after his family all settles there, it says Joseph died, his brothers died, and a generation passes, and a new Pharaoh, it says in the biblical account, a new Pharaoh rises to the throne who has no regard for Joseph. And he says, these Israelites are growing too numerous. Let's slap them into bondage and keep an eye on them. And the biblical passage even says, lest they rejoin our enemies and retake our nation from us. What's interesting about that is Amos the First. He is the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. And he ousts the Hyksos after their 110-year rule. And then this new pharaoh comes to the throne. And I believe the plausible thing is this, and the Egyptians are known for this. They enslaved or placed into hard bondage the remnants of these shepherding peoples, so as not to, so as they could not then turn against them and retake that throne in the north. So I think there's a plausibility, without getting into all the minutiae of all the details, there is a plausibility that's established for the Israelites being there. And I think that this carries all through the Moses story. And the timeline, I'll just give you this and then relinquish the floor.
Well, actually, let's hold the timeline for now. Because we're just kind of like setting the stage here. But let me ask you a little follow-up question on that. And this is kind of for both of you. I think it's interesting what you're saying, that you're thinking it was the Hyksos that were, or the shepherding people that were enslaved. And that does fall under the whole purview of why people ended up being slaves.
Well, let me clarify that.
Sense.
Let me clarify that. I don't think it was the Hyksos that were enslaved, but I think the Israelite family was part of this en masse group of Asiatics known as the Hyksos, that they were the remnant that were still left there, and they got slapped into bondage. Right.
But this is something that has always made me go, huh? When you read through some of the biblical narrative and I'm going to say it's in Deuteronomy, but, it's somewhere in the Torah, it talks about where God talks to Moses about Sabbath and how you're supposed to treat your slaves. So if the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, why would a slave turn around and 2 years later, or however long later, end up with slaves themselves? Could it have been they were just an indentured group, a group of laborers versus slaves in the way we think of slaves.
Now, who are you talking about ended up with slaves a couple of years later?
Well, there isn't any identification in the Old Testament that the Israelites had slaves, but there are prohibitions and rules about how you're supposed to treat your slaves. Well, why would you have prohibitions and rules about how to treat your slaves if you didn't have slaves?
Well, I would only speculate to say who says somebody his family's been in bondage in his history for the last few hundred years has been one of bondage to Egypt, to go into this new land and say, hey, I'm going to get me some slaves.
Well, that was kind of my point. It's like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense unless they were more of a labor class and they had slaves.
I think we look at this sometimes through the filter of 21st century thinking, the way we would think if we were in that situation. I don't think they thought that way. I think slavery was as normal as being a free man back then. And it all depended upon what side of that coin you ended up on, or who happened to attack your camp at night and take you into bondage, or whose camp you attacked that night. I think it was just a thing of constant flip-flopping back and forth. Even the New Testament gave prohibitions in Israel, an established nation for, at that point, at least 1,400 years.
You see, here lies the problem. Where in the archaeological record is there evidence to suggest that there were slaves of the Hebrew nation residing within Egypt?
Well, how many family clans do you think were mentioned? If the Hyksos were comprised, or these Asiatics, as they call them, were comprised of several different kinds, if not dozens or not hundreds of family clans over 800 years that are all amalgamated and become incorporated or thoroughly Egyptianized in a sense. What is to say they had any records of who these people were by this point, other than, these are the Asiatics? I think there is
no evidence to suggest that they were.
Is there not history that says Amos the First, when ousting the Hyksos, took the remnant of the Hyksos and imposed them into hard labor?
Hard labor, but not slaves.
Well, you call it hard labor, call it a slave. If you force me to work for you, I'm going to go, you slave master?
Well, why would we do that now?
No, because that's a play on words. And again, we're using modern language to interpret a different set of rules.
I think this is where we get into what you already mentioned, John, the 72 rabbis. Keep in mind, if Moses indeed wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, including the book of Exodus through Deuteronomy, if he wrote those books, remember, John already mentioned between the 4 and 500s BC, after Israel had been taken bondage by Babylon, which is a historical fact, and they're released and they're sent back to their homeland. What do these rabbis do? It says that 72 rabbis came knocking at the door of Ptolemy II, the Greco-Roman pharaoh of Egypt, and said, we'd like to come into the Library of Alexandria and reestablish the records of our people. And this is where they rewrote the books of the law, the books of the prophets, the books of the minor prophets. All of this stuff took place there. They rewrote all of this from records at the Library of Alexandria, plus their oral traditions as a people. And they had 2 goals. One, to bolster the faithful of Israel, and to 2, reestablish their history. And what came out of that over several years was what we know today as the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is basically where we get our English version of the Old Testament, came from a translation of the Septuagint. So this is why I think you don't have any names of the pharaohs in the Exodus account. In the Life of Moses account, I think there's missing a lot of information. I think slaves were probably what they called the people in that. Now, this is speculation. We don't know for sure. But John is very right when he says, are they slaves? There's no reason to think they were slaves because they're not mentioned as being slaves anywhere other than in what we have in the Septuagint representing the book of Moses. But we also have in that same book, in the Septuagint, this is something, remember, they always want to put Ramses II, the pharaoh, as being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Well, it's hinged on one phrase in the Old Testament. That's the only source point for it. It says the Hebrews or the Israelites built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, which is Pi-Ramses in history. And we know that this is a city that was built by Ramses II, who lived in the mid-1200s BC. However, all the other records seem to indicate that the Exodus was 18th dynasty, 200 years earlier, or 150 years earlier in John's case. And so you say, well, is that it? Can we pinpoint it that quickly? The Hebrews built the treasure cities of Ramses. The problem is, when they wrote the Septuagint, the city that they knew of was Pi-Ramses. What they didn't really know at that time was there was a city underneath it that was a few hundred years older, before Ramses, who was great at this, usurping old cities, old monuments, putting his own name on them. Beneath the city of Pi-Ramses was the city of Avaris, which is squarely in the region that was called Goshen in the Bible. And this was a city that now there's no, well, I don't want to get into too deep because it just gets too long, but this is the city that would have been there. And it's rather like this. I use this example. Who built the city of New York? Well, the Dutch. Well, no, they didn't. The Dutch built New Amsterdam.
No, it was the Iroquois.
Oh, there you go, the Iroquois Confederacy. But the English turned it into New York, on the top of or in the midst of New Amsterdam. And so it's that same kind of thing. The Hebrews, the Israelites would have been part of the workforce that built New Amsterdam. And later, the scribes called it New York. And it's that kind of a thing, I think, that you're looking at in the biblical passage. So were they slaves? We don't know. The biblical account says they were slaves. Could that be an exaggeration? Could that be the scribe said, well, were we really slaves back then? Or we were just working for them? Yeah, but we were forced to work for them. We didn't have anywhere. Let's just call it slaves. You know, is that what happened? We don't know.
I think it was used for dramatic effect.
Very possibly.
And again, as you said many times, to bolster the faithful. I think it was used to bring self-pity upon them. Again, oh, the poor Hebrew nation. Yeah, there was.
Well, they are good at that.
Well, it's like.
Wait, let John talk.
Sorry. I was going to amplify his
It's
point,
that British voice, you know. We want to hear it for a minute. Because we have 3 minutes till break, maybe.
Oh, please allow Scotty to say his piece. Otherwise, he'll just throw his tantrums and throw his toys.
I have nothing to say.
I'm sure you want to sensationalize something. You are American, after all.
John's greatest quote ever. I'm not American. I do not sensationalize.
Exactly. Not like the Hebrews, you know. I think they really did hype up the situation, and that was purely to make themselves look hard done by. There is, and again, I have to reiterate this, there is no evidence to suggest that they were slaves.
Oh, you must be an anti-Semite.
Oh, please. It's missing. It's missing from the archaeological record. And again, we can turn to the Bible, and when Moses said, bring your people and gather your belongings and put them on your back and so forth, and people brought their bowls and they brought their leavened bread and da-da-da-da-da. Was this across the whole of Egypt? Because if you remember rightly, Egypt during the ancient period, its borders were all the way down past Sudan, all the way over into Libya.
Which is, almost 1,000 miles south.
I mean,
of
did
Memphis.
these people, what did they do? And how did they communicate this message? Oh, we're going to up and leave next Thursday at 2 p.m. Make sure you arrive promptly at 1 p.m. so we can do a head count, and make sure you bring your packed lunches with you, and also bring a little bit of money for the train journey. I mean,
they created an event on Facebook. Come on.
It's just laughable in some respects, but that then falls within the realms of our faith, and this is what we discuss within the pages of Exodus Reality, because you have to take it on faith that these extraordinary biblical events took place, even though there is no hard evidence to support that. We just take it on faith. And I don't have a problem with that. I'll state that now. I do not have a problem with that. if I had faith, that is. But for me, no. I work backwards, and so I work from fact first, and then I take it from fact and find out whether we can actually extrapolate any information from that fact that then can support the biblical action.
Well, okay. Well, the time is here. Perfect, John.
That's why I stopped.
Perfect. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Scotty Roberts and John Ward about their book, The Exodus Reality, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. We've been here talking to Scott Roberts and John Ward about their book, Exodus Reality. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. Jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide, www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Also by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer. And if you're looking for one of my books, CDs, or any of that cool stuff, soulhealer.com. Guys, before the break, I don't know, we were talking about a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to kind of shift gears here a little bit, but keep sort of in line with where we were. One of the things that I noticed both in the book and in our discussion was that there seems like there's a lot of dissension in the dating of the Exodus. Why is that? And and John, we're going to start with you this time. Why is that?
Basically, because there is no consensus. Even amongst us good old scholars, we can't agree on the dates. The chronological record is forever shifting. And it's forever shifting because we're forever finding stuff. And so as long as we always say, you know, the old adage, as long as an archaeologist has his trowel in the ground, history is forever changing. And because it's forever changing, so is the chronological record. Now, when it comes to the Exodus, again, Scotty, he places his during the time of Hatshepsut and Tuthmosis. I place mine during the time of Amenhotep III, still within the realms of the 18th dynasty, separated by, I think it's about 60 odd years, if I remember rightly, Scotty.
Closer to like 85. I put mine in reign of actually Amenhotep II. So there you go.
And then if you go to other likable souls, which we're not going to mention his name, and other academics, they put it towards the time of Ramesses II and so forth. It really, again, it falls within the realms of speculation. It falls within the realms of show us the evidence. Where's the facts? Where is this fact? Where at what point did this mass of people just up and leave? Where is the archaeological record? The one good thing that the Egyptians are noted for was the invention of the written language, and they were fastidious at recording their history. It's on the temple walls. It's on papyri. It's on ostraca. It's everywhere you look. Every square inch is covered in hieroglyphic text or demotic inscriptions or hieratic inscriptions or Greek inscriptions, Latin inscriptions. It's everywhere. If the Exodus took place within antiquity, why is there not a written record? Where is it written? Where is it made a mark? Where has the common man made his historical mark as a tribute to this mass up and leaving of so many people?
I have to ask you a question in the middle of that, John. Why then are there questions about Ramses II and the part he actually played in the Battle of Kadesh? Why is there with Hatshepsut? Why is there still question as to whether or not she really did go to Punt herself? Why are there questions? Because you can record lots of things. You find all kinds of things written about these pharaohs. How much do we really know about Amenhotep, son of Hapu, other than what you can string together and maybe take you an hour long to read? That doesn't comprise a 110-year-old life or even an 80-year-old life. So,
no, it doesn't.
so this is the thing about anything that's recorded. We have tidbits, we have pieces, we have highlights. Temple inscriptions don't usually give you the mundane. Temple paintings, tomb paintings don't give you the mundane all the time.
But if we're to really sully the waters, so to speak, and not that I want to cause a ruckus on our own behalf, really, but if we look at, say, the Temple Wars of Edfu, there we have the mundane. There we have a priest.
Oh, that's true.
Who's recorded the entire construction of the temple site, right down to the builders themselves. And yet when it comes to the Exodus, it's missing from the archaeological record. No one's mentioned it.
And why not tie them to the Hyksos expulsion, which is documented?
Yeah. Why
I don't think that the dates don't work.
So that goes back to what Rita was asking about the chronological record, and both of us agree on this, Scotty. Even though theories are different, we both agree that from a chronological point of view, one cannot be precise because we just weren't there. We can hypothesize and we can speculate based upon our scanty records and our scanty tidbits, as you put it, that we've put together to bolster our own hypotheses and our theories based upon our individual characterizations of the Moses and of the Exodus itself. But both of us at the same time quite admit within the pages of Exodus Reality that we're open to interpretation. It's open to discussion.
Right.
It can change at any time. We're both open to that. What we've done merely is to articulate and formulate our own theories based upon the material at hand. And I think we've actually done a fair job of doing that. And I think it goes hand in hand as well, because there are so many other books out there on the Exodus and so forth that rip apart the biblical scripture, that do not pay credit to the religious side of it, the spiritual side of it, the faith issues and so forth. But both Scotty and I, we've tried to keep as close to that as possible without degrading the biblical scripture, trying to keep within the realms of the historical markers that are mentioned within the biblical narrative, but at the same time bring into focus our own theories and our own hypotheses based upon living events and living persons who have been documented, who have had their history recorded on the temple walls and can be verified as living persons. We cannot verify Moses himself, the character, the actual man written within the Old Testament, as a person. It's remiss from the history books. The Exodus is remiss from the history books. But through our two theories, we're able to put those tidbits together, theorize, and come up with plausible scenarios that can actually stand their own ground. Both of them independently can stand their own ground, and then open for discussion and debate afterwards. Quite easy, really.
Yes.
I thought so, anyway.
And I agree with you. I have to agree with you there. Whereas
I don't agree with me. Oh no,
I would. Agree with you. I would. John presents a very cogent theory, and I think very well thought out, very well researched for years, and it's very plausible with his character of Moses and his description of what the Exodus would have been, or even the 10 plagues. These are things that I look at that and I see this is very plausible. You've got a very sound theory, and you almost convince me. Except I believe my theory is very sound. Only I don't have Moses as an archetype. I have him as an individual who I think we can pinpoint, at least within the degree of plausibility, and which it might be all we have. And perhaps that evidence is still sitting out there. Perhaps that evidence is long gone. I know that there are some. What is the stone? Is it called the Alish stone? I can't think of it off the top of my head. There was the stone that was found that had the inscriptions, and it was a stone that was actually supporting a cattle watering trough somewhere in a little town in Egypt. And this stone shows what they think depicts hieroglyphics talking about the parting of the Red Sea, or the parting of waters, and slaves and emancipation and all of this. There are things in other areas of the world that. Go ahead.
It's very loose, that interpretation.
It's very loose interpretation.
Very loose.
But it's also talking about almost a fable, not a fable because it involves animals, almost an allegorical story that uses names that do connect with some of the. I know one of them was Hatshepsut, that was connected with the story, not as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but connected to the story. So there's things like this that show up. If you've heard of Szymka Jakubowici, he had the show The Naked Archaeologist on History International before it became History H2. And
he tied him to the Hyksos Rebellion or expulsion.
He actually tied it. He did originally. Then he moved that up a little bit because of this El Arish stone, and so again, it's so up in the air because nobody knows for sure. There's nothing solid. I know that I was criticized for my theory of who I thought Moses was, saying, "What a silly theory!" And it's some scholar out there that knocked it, and he says it's obviously. Your guy is not Moses. What a silly theory. What a silly thing you've threaded together. But I think it's much more plausible that Moses murdered your guy. And I said, well, you've just placed it in the same dating system. You've just placed it under the same Pharaoh. You've just placed all these things together, except you say, my guy couldn't have been Moses because it's implausible. But it's plausible that my guy was the guy Moses murdered when he fled Egypt. So, well, what do you do with that?
You throw your arms up in the air and say, yes, okay, move along, nothing to see here.
Right.
Well, with that said, actually, I have a question. There are a lot of people who tie Moses and the Israelites to the teachings of Akhenaten. Where does Akhenaten fit, I'm going to say, in the chronology of who you think the Pharaoh was that let their people go?
I will say it in 2 words. Not Moses.
You see, this is where my theory then stacks up. Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, who he was originally before he changed his name and became enlightened, shall we say, as a dictator. He was the son of Amenhotep III, the pharaoh, who I believe is the pharaoh of the Exodus. But there is a plausibility here of co-regency. And again, this is something that's been debated and discussed for years amongst academics. And again, no one has agreed on it. And the co-regency theory between Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, or as he was later known as Akhenaten. Now, if my guy, Amenhotep, son of Hapu, he was the steward and the vizier, the great architect, blah, 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 etc., 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 under both of these gentlemen. And so Akhenaten does play a pivotal role, especially within my theory, because it was Akhenaten who took the remains of the survivors of ancient Thebes to Amarna, which he'd been building for 15 years prior to the demise, the fall of Thebes. And so it was just by happen chance, I suppose, maybe, or was it prophecy? We can hark back to a prophecy that Hapu had mentioned to his pharaoh that that Egypt would fall into chaos. Was he right? Was Akhenaten privy to this information? But then we have the third son, or the second son, sorry, and that was the crown prince, the true heir to the throne of Egypt, and that was the crown prince Thutmose, and he was missing. He all of a sudden just disappears out of the history books. His tomb is empty, the same as his sister, the princess Sitamun, who became the wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. He married his own daughter. She disappears out of the history book, along with other viziers and countless architects and so forth from the higher echelons of the house of Amenhotep. They all disappear roughly around about the same time. The tombs have been left empty in In Thebes themselves, we're discovering tombs even today that are empty. They've never even been used. And so one has to ask the question, what happened to these people? Where did they go? Why didn't they use their tombs? Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who I believe is the archetype for Moses, he was a commoner, just a normal man. Yet he was allowed to build a temple that dwarfed that of Pharaoh Thutmose III. It was a massive place. His mortuary temple on the west bank, between the temples of Thutmose, Medina Habu, and the Ramesseum, adorned with a glistening pyramid. So it was said by the Italian archaeological mission that did the excavations there. It was the stones that were found, the limestone blocks that were found at this temple, that mentioned the dedication to the temple by the stewards and by the mayor of Memphis, that happened to actually be the cousin, or the nephew of Amenhotep, son of Hapu. But Hapu was missing. He wasn't there. Was he dead? Well, according to his statue that had been erected in Karnak, within the halls of Karnak, again, a commoner having his statue placed within the actual halls of Karnak, the house of Amun-Ra, the great sun god himself. There his statue stood, and on it said, "I give thanks and praise for reaching the age of 80 years, and look forward to reaching and attaining 110. Please bring me your supplication and leave me an offering, and I will basically intervene between yourself and God, as has been deemed by my Pharaoh." And so here you had a common man who all of a sudden, even during his lifetime, while he was still alive, became divine. He was able to intercede between God, Amun-Ra, and yourself, if you came with a prayer or a desire. And it just smacks in the face that all of a sudden this guy, who was a mortal, a commoner, had a temple dedicated to him that he built himself. Massive place. He had statues erected within the halls of Karnak. And yet everybody then starts to disappear. And even he then disappears from the history books. He's missed, he's gone. Then when we look at Akhenaten, which was your question, Akhenaten existed within Amarna. If we go back to ancient Thebes, the capital, the only thing we have about Akhenaten is one wine seal with his name on at Malkata, the palace of Malkata. And one of the interesting things about the palace of Malkata was that it was built for the said festival of Amenhotep III, and it was built by Amenhotep, son of Hapu. But the rooms, and the Princeton University and Waseda University carried out excavations there as recently as 2013, I believe it was. 2013 was the last excavation there. And within the excavation, they came across all what they call the staterooms that would have been basically the housing for the guests of the said festival. And these would have been dignitaries from foreign lands, from all over Egypt and so forth, a multitude of rooms. Yet when Waseda and Princeton excavated them, they got down to the floor level, and they found that the limestone flooring, or the lime coarse flooring, was pristine. Not even a chip, but not even a shard of pottery, not even a bead, not even organic material. There was nothing archaeologically to date the floor laying on it. It's as if they'd actually been cleaned, swept clean, and then sand poured on top of them to preserve them and bury them for all eternity, and until Princeton turns up, of course, with a nice trowel and starts digging away. And that points to what I was my theory about the breaking of the lake and the whole Exodus theory. But it does, all these pointers do point to the point where something happened at Thebes that was the catalyst that allowed Akhenaten to go to Amarna. It allowed his father, the reigning pharaoh, to remain in Thebes, but it also allowed the higher echelons to just up and leave overnight, and just disappear from the annals of history. It's very interesting.
It's a very interesting theory.
Let me ask John a follow-up question. Would Hapu have been Jewish? Would he have been an Egyptian? How does he fit into the story of, being found in the, raft thing?
I'm sorry. How he was found in the...
Well, in the biblical narrative, Moses was found in the raft and he was of Jewish descent. Would Hapu have been Jewish as well, or is that just part of the Moses persona to add to the story?
No, I think that's all part of the sensationalization by the rabbis at the Alexandria Museum. Again, I think they were trying to establish a origin for their religion, an origin for their people, and Moses fits the bill there, but he has to be Jewish to start off with. And again, that then would probably hark to what Scotty was talking about the shepherds and the Canaanites and so forth, and the Hyksos and la-di-da-di-da. But I don't believe for 1 second that Hapu was of he. I mean, we've got to really draw a line here. There was no Jewish, there was no Hebrew, there was no Israel. It did not exist. These people possibly worshipped a different set of gods, maybe Baal, for instance, Mithra. Who knows? Because we don't know. We have no record of it, so we don't know. And no, for 1 minute, no. Hapu was Egyptian. He was a scribe, first and foremost. He was a priest of Amun-Ra. He was basically an Egyptian. He knew the pantheon of gods. He knew the scriptures inside and out. He knew the Ipu papyri inside and out. He would have known the Book of Dead inside and out, the Book of Life inside and out, the Book of Earth and the Book of the Garden, the Book of Gates. He would have known all of this off by heart. And again, I return to the very end of my theory where I wrote it in Nexus Reality, where he was stood or sat at Serebet el-Khadim, surrounded by the stellae. And it was there that he would have transcribed parts of the Book of the Gates and the Book of the Dead and the Book of Life, but more importantly, aspects of the Ipu papyri upon the stellae, and carried them down and gave them to the crown prince Tutmosis and said, there you are. These are the rules and regulations for your people. Go lead them, rule them. And I believe that was the beginning of the so-called Hebrew nation.
Interesting. All right, Scotty, your turn.
Well, first of all, I want to mention one thing about the birth of Moses. While the Bible describes it as he was born to a slave mother and she hid him out for a few months until she couldn't hide him anymore, and then puts him in this little basket and floats him down the Nile where Pharaoh's daughter finds him and names it Moses, meaning I drew him out of the water, and so on. So this is the story presented in the Bible. And people have poo-pooed that story as being part of the mythology of Moses because, well, that's just like the Osirian story, where Osiris is cut up into pieces, floated down in the baskets on the Nile, and so on, and other archetypes. But my contention is this: do you think that the Hebrews, who weren't really Hebrews, the Israelite family at this point, they weren't Jews, because Judaism had not yet been codified, which is what Moses did later. Possibly. If you want to discount the entire thing and say it's all a made-up story, or are there elements of the story that are real? I tend to think, and John and I discuss this a lot, that the Israelites were thoroughly Egyptianized because they'd been there for at least a couple of hundred years, this family clan, and had grown there. And if they were in bondage, so be it. If they weren't, so be it. If they were indentured servants, who knows? But I think Moses' mother, being thoroughly Egyptianized, knew well the Osirian story. And I think she knew exactly where the princess bathed on the canal of the river. And I do believe that it took place in Memphis, and that she played into the religious sensibilities of the young princess by, in a sense, mimicking the Osirian story. And the Bible never says she placed the basket in the Nile and floated it down the main river of the Nile, the main channel. It says she took a basket and placed it in the reeds on the banks of the river. And the Pharaoh's daughter went there to bathe daily. And this is where she found him. I think it was well placed, and she sent Miriam, his older sister, along to make sure, you know, the Pharaoh's daughter found her. Then it says she found him, she named him, gave him back to his mother until she was old enough to receive him. And this fits a story that seems to fit the timeline that's presented in the Bible. Now, I use as a hinge pin for my theory the biblical timeline. Now, whether we can trust that timeline is what's at question. But the biblical timeline basically says this. If you go to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 6, verse 1, this is in the reign of Solomon, the son of David. And in this verse, he's dedicating the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this would be almost 1,000 years after the time of Moses. I'm sorry, this would be about 500 years after the time of Moses. And he's dedicating the temple, and it says on this day, it says, on the day that Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, it was the 480th year since the Exodus. Now, we have pretty good information on what archaeology refers to as Temple 1 in Jerusalem. It dates to the mid-10th century BC, or roughly the 950s to the 960s. And the median date, give or take literally 3 to 7 years in either direction, is 966 BC for the founding of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, if the 480 years is not just a rounded off figure for numerological sake, if it was roughly 480 years, you end up with a backdating of roughly 1445 to 1446 BC. And sitting on the throne at this time was a pharaoh named Amenhotep II, who was in the 5th year of his very young reign. He was probably around 23 years old. He had been co-regent with his father, Tutmosis III. And you backdate, if Moses was indeed, as the Bible account says, around 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, 1446, he would have been born roughly 1526 BC. And this would have been under the reign of Tutmosis I. And Tutmosis I had a daughter. She was known as, by title, known as Pharaoh's daughter. And this, I think, this is my own speculation, I think this is the only homage that is in the book of Exodus now to one of the actual people, and that would be Hatshepsut. Her name was Matakari, the daughter of Tutmosis I. Matakari, she would have been about 7 to 10 years old in 1526 BC, which would be roughly, if you took the biblical story of the Exodus and you started to try to line them up, you say, it's plausible, it fits here. Now, interestingly, there is a man that I believe was the man Moses, not just an archetype. John has Amenhotep, son of Hapu, is fitting a lot of the features of Moses and believes that he was an archetype that really turned into the legend of Moses. I believe that there was a man who was Moses and was raised to great status in Egypt. Now, there was a man in the household of Hatshepsut who was named Senenmut. And all we know of Senenmut is that he was born to commoners, but he rose to the level of, first of all, the tutor to Hatshepsut's daughter, the Princess Neferuri, and that he eventually became the Grand Royal Architect. He was given 92 royal titles by Hatshepsut. She named him the chief royal architect. She elevated him to the position of Grand Vizier, once again, Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. And she also gave him the title, the hereditary crown prince of Egypt. And this is the man, Senenmut. Now, I thought a very interesting thing about his name alone, Senenmut, in Egyptian actually means mother's brother. In essence,
well,
she
didn't they have like a thing going on?
Well, this is another element of the story. She named him Senenmut, which means mother's brother. I, your mother, am elevating you to the status of brother to the gods with me. Now, she could have meant I, your physical mother, I, the mother of Egypt, as the Pharaoh, but she elevates him to this position. Now, she gave him that name before she was Pharaoh. So she was probably not the mother of Egypt at that point. So she renames him. Whatever his original name was is not mentioned in the records. But about the time the biblical record places Moses as at 40 years old, murdering the Egyptian taskmaster, fleeing Egypt, you've got Senenmut, about the same age, disappears off the Egyptian scene. All we know again about him, born to commoners, he raised to great status, and then he disappears. He leaves behind 2 tombs, amazing tombs, neither of them used, neither of them finished. And within the year, Hatshepsut herself dies, and her son, Tutmosis III, takes the throne. And it's his son, 40 years later, Amenhotep II, that I believe was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, there's some interesting facts around this. First of all, you mentioned, didn't they have a thing, Senenmut and Hatshepsut? It's speculated that they had a thing. And keep in mind, if these are the actual people, as mentioned in the Exodus story, she was about 7 to 10 years older than he was. He's an adopted son. Keep in mind, once again, this is a royal house that would intermarry, brother and sister, and so on. I think a woman who elevated him, who found a baby, adopted him, elevated him to status, then renamed him my brother, equal with me to the gods, may have even been done totally speculative, might have been done because of that scenario. We don't know for sure. All we know is that there's speculation that they were close. There's even some pornographic type graffiti up in the cave above her temple, the workers' cave, showing Senenmut shagging Hatshepsut. And so you've got this going on. Now, let's look at the fact that Senenmut disappears off the scene around 1486 BC, around that time. He disappears. But 40 years later, you've got Thutmose III, when he took the, I'm going to confuse you if I'm not careful. About a year after, within the year of Senenmut disappearing, Hatshepsut dies. She had deposed in a way, but was co-regent for a time, but deposed her stepson, who became the pharaoh then in his own right after her death, Thutmose III. He rises to great status, becomes a great pharaoh. 40 years later, becomes co-regent in his elderly years with his son for a couple of years, Amenhotep II. Now, when he first took the throne, because he had been a co-regent who had been pushed aside and Hatshepsut took his place as pharaoh, the female pharaoh, I think he worked very hard to establish, I am now the pharaoh. And it says that he is the one who eradicated all of Hatshepsut's images off of her temple, off all the inscriptions and all of this, off the temple walls, and totally tried to wipe out her image. But current archaeology on this and data on this is that it was less him and more his son 40 years later who wiped out the images of Hatshepsut. But what was very interesting 40 years later is that not only does he wipe out the images of Hatshepsut, he wipes out every image of Senenmut at the same time. And there is a speculative conjecture that he did this because Senenmut returned as Moses, and the Exodus took place. And so he's eradicating his images along with his grandmother, as his dad's stepmother. He's eradicating all these images. Now, that it's speculation, it's circumstantial, but the dating system seems to fit. There is another thing about dating the Exodus that I think is very important. Remember I said Ramses II, people want to place it on.
Let me just interject one quick second.
Yep.
One quick second.
Yes.
Because I want to get to a question on the Sinai, and we have like 15 minutes, especially we want to talk about paradigm. So under 15 minutes.
I can wrap this story. I'll just say I believe Senenmut was the man Moses.
Well, I think it's interesting, and this is not even the question I wanted to ask, but that there are a number of pharaohs that are like Tutmosis, Ra Moses. I mean, it's kind of like everybody's got the Moses name.
Well, I think it's interesting that Senenmut actually grew up in the midst of the Tutmosian family line. You had Tutmosis I, who was the father of Hatshepsut. You had Tutmosis II, who was married to Hatshepsut. You have Tutmosis III, who was her stepson, who took over after she died. And then his son, Amenhotep II, was the pharaoh, I believe, of the Exodus. And you've got Moses, who is renamed by Hatshepsut. We don't know what his original name was in Egyptian history, this man Senenmut, but Senenmut was the name she gave him, elevating him to the status of mother, elevating you to the status of brother.
Hey, just think about it. We had Tut Moses, Tut Moses, Tut Moses.
Right.
Actually, 2 weeks ago, I was like, man, we got this like Moses thing going on. A couple of weeks ago, I had Robert Feather on talking about Moses. And I want to kind of go and talk about the Sinai, or where, the mountain is, the magic mountain. And he suggested that the location of the Holy Mountain is where the Israelites set up camp was a mountain that had once been controlled by the Midianites, and there were a number of copper mines, I think is what he said. What do you think of that idea? And do you place the Israelites and the mountain there, or do you put it someplace else?
I think it's very interesting, and John will concur with me on the mountain. There's a little mountain that's about 40 to 50 miles inland from the Red Sea, about midway down that finger of the Red Sea that sticks up, and into the Sinai. And this little mountain's called the Serabet el-Khadim. And at this mountain, there's an old temple at the top. And it was really just a cave to start with, the cave of Ptah. And then the cave of Hathor is next to it. Now, Hathor is the cow goddess of fertility, happiness. She became the patron god of the miners. They're the slaves and the workers and all of this who were miners in that area, mining copper and turquoise and all of this. And on this little plateau mountaintop, there was this temple there. And then for about 1,500 years, successive pharaohs built chambers, if you will, little rooms out from this cave. And you could actually go to the front gate, which ended with Ramesses VI. And you could start at Ramesses VI and walk all the way back through all these pharaohs 1,500 years to the cave. And this is up on the top of the mountain. Now, keep in mind the biblical story. What did it say? The people, it says, they were camped at the mountain of God. And Moses had gone up into the mountain for 40 days. And they come to Aaron and they go, in the biblical account, it says, where is this man Moses? Build us a God. In the vernacular of the Hebrew there, they're basically saying, where's this guy? This Moses who led us here. He's gone. He's up in the mountain. Build us an idol that we may worship, or a god that we may worship. And what does he produce? The calf, the golden calf, which is a representation of Hathor. This is the mountain whose mountain they are at, with the temple of Hathor at the top. And so they build a god, I believe, to honor the god of whose mountain they're camped at, where Moses has disappeared. And as John mentioned earlier, there was a class of priests who lived there. And if you go up there today, and John and I were up there, and there's like nothing. You're in the middle of the Sinai desert. The wilderness, as the Bible calls it. And you're up on this plateau, and there's hieroglyphs on the walls on the way up on the old ceremonial paths they took up there. And you get to the top and you see this temple, and there's these stelae. Think of an old tombstone, a curved topped tombstone. These are littered all over the place up there. These stelae ranging from a foot tall to 8 feet tall. All over you see waste piles of broken stelae, or stelae that were unused in the workshops up there. And they're still sitting there thousands of years later. And remember, it said Moses came down with the tablets, or the stelae of the law. Carved on these stelae. I think, and John thinks as well as I do, that whoever Moses was, he led the people to this place. And I believe more literally went up to the top, conferred with the priest, came down with the law. The law, as John established in the book, it came from the admonitions of an Egyptian sage. Is it admonitions of an Egyptian sage, John?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, right. And make sure I have my title right. And this is where the Ten Commandments came from. Moses, whoever he was, in the wilderness there, was very Egyptianized, and that comes out in everything he did. The form of religion, the law he established, the Ark of the Covenant, which is a bark shrine, an Egyptian bark shrine, the layout of the temple, the tabernacle, the tented temple, the tabernacle of the covenant is laid out just like an Egyptian Egyptian holy place and holy of holies, the different implements, all the things point to Egyptian religion being used to create. I believe Moses created Judaism. He codified it for the first time out of, and pardon me, all my Jewish friends out there, he codified it. He created something out of whole cloth. He incorporated Egyptian religion. He incorporated Canaanite religion, Sinaitic religion, Mesopotamian religion, and came out with, in this blender, this stew, which we know today as Judaism.
Very well said.
Thank you all.
You're welcome, brother.
Do you agree with that location?
Oh, 100%.
Yes.
100%. Rita.
Ooh, you agree on something?
This is something we agree on. Yeah.
No, Serabit El Khadim is by far, I would say, I have to say, the best contender. But I don't think there is another contender on the Sinai Peninsula. It is what it is. And it's exactly as Scotty.
I think St. Catherine's, the traditional place, which you see, even the images in the movies are based on the mountain there. Is that Jebel Musa at St. Catherine's? The traditional site. It's too far east. It's just too far.
The other thing you've got to take into consideration is the trade routes. Either Senemet or Hapu, depending which theory you want to go with, they would have known the existence of the trade routes. They would have known the watering wells that were along these trade routes. And this trade route falls just in line of Serabit El Khadim. It's nowhere near Gebel Musa, nowhere near St. Catherine's Mount. And to get lost in the mountains for 40 years? No. I think they set up...
I'm sorry, John. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Continue. Please.
I was just going to say, as for the location, John places the Exodus starting in Thebes, down south. I place it in Memphis. And just to the east and the north of Memphis, of course, is Pi-Ramses, or Avaris, the old city where the Hebrews and most of the Israelites most probably dwelled. And right from about that point is the old trade route, the Wadi Tumilat, which takes you from the west, the east side of the Delta region where Pi-Ramses would have existed, Avaris would have existed. There's this little arc. You can still see it on the satellite images even today, and follow it today. The Wadi Tumilat goes down to the northern tip of the Red Sea. And what was north of the Red Sea now, and even back then, well, right now you get the Suez Canal going through there, but there's the Bitter Lakes region. There are these shallow lakes. And one of them is called the Sea of Reeds, which is actually the better translation in the Hebrew for the Red Sea mentioned in the book of Exodus. Mistranslation. It's the Sea of Reeds. And this is the shallow lake region to the north of the Red Sea. And what do you find as you cross the northern tip of the Red Sea through these bitter lakes? You end up at a place that's about 3,000 years old called the Well of Moses. And this is the watering hole on the way. And then they traveled, down 40, 50 miles down the east coast of the Red Sea and then inland, following the trade routes. And this is where, and the Bible does say they stopped in this area and picked up more of the Israelites who were working, and other workers joined them in the mining fields in the Sinai. So it's very interesting stuff.
That is interesting. But I think I'm going to put a period there because, well, we have 10 minutes. But anyway, I would like to spend a little bit of time speaking about the Paradigm Symposium that's coming up this October. I want to give that some airtime. So,
all right,
whichever of you would like to step forward on that.
Go for it, Scotty.
All right, I'll go for it. Well, the Paradigm Symposium, we founded this in 2012, and you were at the first Paradigm Symposium.
I was.
And you will be at this Paradigm Symposium as one of our headline speakers. And the Paradigm Symposium, I founded Intrepid Magazine back in December of 2010, and we really took off in April of 2011. Our first issue came out, and it was a year later that Micah Hanks, good friend of all of ours, and I said, let's do a little event. Let's put an event together.
A little event.
And so the Paradigm Symposium grew out of that. And it was October of 2012. We had the whole cast of Ancient Aliens and you and John and several other authors there. And it started creating a little bit of a wow factor. And if I can be so bold as to use the words of the late Philip Coppens, who was a good friend. He said, I remember a month after the symposium, about a month before he died, he issued, a couple of weeks after the symposium, he issued this little statement that said, the Paradigm Symposium has swift become the #1 alternative conference in the United States, if not the world. And so we went on, we did 2013. We had people like Robert Bivall, Dr. Robert Schock, a lot of these people there. Then we did 2014 just this last year, where we had Graham Hancock, Robert Bivall, and some other people that are very well known. And now John has become my full-fledged partner in all of these things. So we are partners together in the Paradigm Symposium, Intrepid Magazine, Intrepid Radio, all of this under the one big umbrella. And so this year, the Paradigm Symposium, October 1st through the 4th. And we've got Rita Louise, John Ward, myself, Micah Hanks, Peter Robbins. We've got Sarah Soderlund. We've got Richard Dolan. We've got Travis Walton, Randall Carlson, several names, Edward Nightingale, Dan Madsen. The name list goes on. Just go to Paradigm.
You forgot Laird. He's like
and Laird Stratton.
Oh, and Nick. Nick has like
Nick
a
Redfern
here at Just Energy Radio.
When I start rattling off the names, I just go, oh, who did I miss out of my head?
Well, and I just think, okay, who have been like our regular people on the show? And you've named a few, and there are a number of people that are going to be speaking at your event that will be coming onto this show in the next couple of months. So, my listeners can get to know them. But guys, if you like my show, I will be there. You can see me up close and personal, and I'll even sign an autograph. And that's especially to you, Marco.
And the best thing about actually being there, I've had people over the last couple of years would always ask us, are you going to stream this? Can we watch it online? And my answer was, no, we're not going to stream this. We considered it at one point, then we thought about that for a second, said, wait a minute. Is there money to be made in streaming it? Well, yeah, hell yeah, there's money to be made in streaming it. But the purpose of an event like this is to gather people together to sit at the feet of people like these people. They're speaking. People like these people. There you go. This is like, I equate the Paradigm Symposium to, it's like sitting at the feet of Socrates, sitting at the feet of the great thinkers, and being present. If you had the ability to look back 30 years from now and say, these were some of the great thinkers, and I got to watch them online. Or versus, I got to sit there and listen to them and then talk to them and spend time with them after hours. That's one of the big things about the Paradigm Symposium, I think, that has created a family atmosphere about it, is it's the after hours stuff. We call it the after effects. People gather together. All the speakers tend to come down into the hotel lobby where everybody's hanging out. We all get drinks. We are playing music, and all of this stuff goes on. We've got lots of musicians that come, and we had a big jam session last year. And all these people are down there. And this is one of the best parts of the Paradigm Symposium, is not just sitting for an hour listening to somebody speak. It's being there to experience them speaking and experience them off stage. And that's one of the things about the Paradigm Symposium. We've always said, if you're going to be here as a speaker, you need to be here to meet people. And you're here for 4 days.
One of the things about your event, and I've only experienced it a couple of times, is you end up having conversations with people, that happen to come sit at your table, or you're all just kind of sitting around in a group, of the meaning of life and the nature of reality, and have extraterrestrials been here, and who is Moses, and did he really exist? And there are these very deep philosophical questions that you wish you could have at home, but you never do.
Yes. Well, exactly. And then you get to have them with these people. Some of the people that you read their books, you see them on TV or in documentaries, you hear about them all the time, and you get to actually be there and meet them face to face, talk to them. That's so much better than watching them on your iPhone or your laptop. Maybe the convenience is you can go to your refrigerator and sit in your undies and do it while you're doing that, and put them on pause if you want to. But that's not the purpose of the Paradigm Symposium. The purpose is not to broadcast it. The purpose is to be there. And we want to create this atmosphere that brings people in. If we wanted to just do a broadcast, we just We wouldn't fly anybody in from anywhere. We wouldn't rent a hotel. We wouldn't rent a hall. We wouldn't fly. We wouldn't pay for anybody's damn airfare from overseas. We would say, sit on your computer and at your webcam at this time, and we'll have an online conference. Well, if people want to do that, that's great. That's not what the Paradigm Symposium is.
Yeah. So, John, you want to add anything in the next minute or promote anything or have anything
I'd
to
like
say?
to promote, of course, the Paradigm Symposium. And if you haven't got your tickets, do go to paradigmsymposium.com and register your interest and buy your tickets now. But more importantly, I want to just quickly say, keep an eye out for friendsofsilsila.com and go and register your interest there and become a member of the Friends of Silsila and maybe even make a donation and help out with becoming part of the legacy of Gebel el-Silsila, the archaeological dig in Upper Egypt. And watch out for the news this coming week. It's going to go international. Can't say any more, but just keep an eye out.
I will say this. They have some amazing international news releasing early next week.
Okay, we'll just post it on Facebook because that's where I get all my information.
Everywhere.
One very, very quick question because the music's going to come up. Your radio show, you have your network. When does your show air?
Sunday nights, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. Go to ipbn-fm.com or just simply our site, intrepidradio.com.
Excellent. Guys, thanks so much for coming on. And I thought we would totally cut and crack up, but we were very good. Very good.
I think John is exhausted and I'm tired.
I managed to stay awake for the entire interview.
Well, thank you.
I managed to stay awake through your portion of the interview. How about that?
So.
Okay, well, they're telling me that the music's rolling, which means I have to go. So thanks, guys, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Rita.
All right. Bye. Bye, Scotty. Bye, John. That's Scott Roberts and John Ward. Their book is The Exodus Reality. And next week, we have a special guest. We have, in the first hour, I'm not 100% sure who we have, but in the second hour, we have the infamous Graham Hancock coming on. So till next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio.